Moscow, evening, Tuesday, 23rd October 1962. In a box at the Bolshoi Theater, Nikita Khrushchev and his colleagues sit in a row. It's grand, all crimson velvet and gold. The audience waits for the show to begin. It's the Russian opera Boris Godunov. Khrushchev has invited everyone to the opera for the optics, to have a calming effect on the people, to show that all is well. There is no danger, nothing to worry about. He is in control. But he later recalls, we ourselves were very anxious at the time. On stage, the opera unfolds. The Tsar, Boris Godunov, fears that there is a plot against him. All that he does for his people seems to go wrong, and his reign unravels as he struggles to maintain control. He dies, leaving Russia in a state of chaos and civil war.
From the BBC World Service, this is The Bomb.
With me, Nina Khrushcheva.
And me, Max Kennedy. Episode 7, Eyeball to Eyeball.
"24 hours earlier, Monday evening, my great-grandfather Nikita Khrushchev is at his home in the Lenin Hills, in a leafy part of Moscow. Then he hears the news. Kennedy is preparing to make an address on TV. There are reports of a crisis in Washington and speculation that it's about Cuba. They have probably discovered our missiles, Khrushchev tells his son Sergei. He urgently calls his presidium members to the Kremlin. They gather in the old Senate building next to Red Square.
It's pretty clear to the Russians that the Americans have finally discovered this secret. The reaction of his fellow Politburo members is really, well, this is Khrushchev's problem. He led us into this, and it's up to him to find a solution. They don't say that aloud because, in the Soviet system, you didn't express any opposition to the leader, but that's very much their feeling. Khrushchev and his fellow Politburo members are gathered around this huge table. Khrushchev is having second thoughts that he's sort of sent all these troops and missiles off to Cuba, and now he's wondering whether it's going to lead to nuclear war with the United States.
The text of Kennedy's speech is on its way from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and they'll get it before the president speaks on TV. As they wait, they talk.
So here we go. Comrade Khrushchev says that he just found out that Kennedy's preparing some statement. And then we have Malinovsky, who's the Minister of Defense. He says here Kennedy is preparing for speech at 2 a.m. our time.
Rodion Malinovsky reassures the group that if America announces an invasion of Cuba, the Kremlin will have time to prepare. It won't happen for 24 hours. But Khrushchev is convinced an attack on Cuba is imminent. He's trying to second-guess the American president. The point is, we didn't want to unleash a war, he says to the room. We wanted to intimidate and restrain the United States.
And then we have this. In connection with the fact that we have not yet concentrated all that we wanted in Cuba, we are giving an instruction to Pliev. Issa Pliev was, of course, the head of the Soviet forces there, that in case of an American invasion of Cuba, Cuba declares war and announces that they will use tactical nuclear weapons.
The tactical weapons include short-range lunar missiles with nuclear warheads for use on a battlefield. But they hold back on authorizing Pliev to use such weapons, for now. They agree to wait until they have seen the text of Kennedy's speech.
In Washington, As President Kennedy prepares to deliver his televised address, the Oval Office is transformed into a television studio. Black fabric is draped over the Resolute desk and stretched with masking tape. A dark board and the presidential flag hang behind President Kennedy.
Good evening, my fellow citizens.
At 7 p.m. Eastern Time in the United States, the broadcast begins. Americans are expecting an announcement about a foreign policy problem. More than 100 million tune in.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
President Kennedy explains the threat that the Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles pose and that they could strike Washington, D.C., Mexico City, or anywhere in the southeastern United States.
Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of traveling more than twice as far, and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru.
The public phase of the missile crisis has begun. It's out in the open, and it is terrifying. People gather around television sets wherever they happen to be. A photo from the Times shows a somber group watching the speech on a wall of TVs in an appliance store. For many of those watching, nuclear war now seems imminent.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
He announces to the world the action that the United States is taking, a naval blockade of Cuba. He calls it a quarantine. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba will be subject to search and turned back if found to be carrying offensive weapons. But the U.S. Navy won't be stopping ships that carry basic necessities to Cuba.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations.
President Kennedy calls for the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of missiles before the quarantine can be lifted. These steps are only the beginning. The United States will increase surveillance of Cuba. If work on the missile sites continues, there'll be further action.
He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction by returning to his government's own words that it had no need to station missiles outside its own territory, and withdrawing these weapons from Cuba, by refraining from any action which will widen or deepen the present crisis, and then by participating in a search for peaceful and permanent solutions.
The speech sends shockwaves around the world.
In Moscow, Premier Khrushchev has been given the text of Kennedy's speech. His mood improves. Cuba is saved, he announces. It's not a war against Cuba, but some kind of ultimatum.
There's a huge sigh of relief. The war is not happening today.
That has given Kennedy more time to work out a diplomatic solution, but it also gives Khrushchev more time to work on a diplomatic solution.
Khrushchev dictates the main points of a statement on the blockade immediately. He denounces it as an act of piracy. The meeting of the Presidium continues throughout the night. The note-taker can hardly keep up.
Issue a Soviet government statement, a protest. The USA is on course for preparing and unleashing the Third World War. American imperialism is trying to dictate its will to everyone else. We protest. All countries have the right to defend themselves.
They turn to what to do about their ships. Khrushchev doesn't want the United States Navy boarding Soviet ships. He also doesn't want to escalate the situation.
The ships that were still far away from Cuba, that can't get to Cuba before the blockade, the quarantine, is introduced, they turn back.
Khrushchev orders the ships that are still carrying the longer range nuclear missiles to turn around and not risk a confrontation with the United States.
But there were some ships that were delivering, let's say, grain, potatoes, agricultural machinery, and so on and so forth, oil. Those guys would keep going. And those ships with the missiles and military equipment that were close to Cuba and can beat the timeline, they should speed up.
Of the ships ordered to remain on course for the island and try to beat the blockade, one, the Alexandrovsk, is of particular concern to Khrushchev.
It's a ship that usually carried refrigerated fish across the ocean, but it's now carrying the nuclear warheads for the medium-range missiles that can hit Washington and New York. As the Alexandrovsk arrives in Cuba, there's huge storms in the ocean, and gale force winds are buffeting the vessel. The warheads are all stored in coffin-like containers below decks. And at one point, nuclear safety officers have to struggle for 3 days and nights to prevent these containers smashing against the bulkheads.
Khrushchev orders everyone to remain in the Kremlin overnight, in case the situation changes. He walks back down the red-carpeted corridor to his office. He lies down on the couch, still wearing his suit. That night, there will be no sleep.
The crisis is out in the open, and the reconnaissance flights over Cuba become more visible, more brazen, too. The president needs better pictures. So 6 Crusader jets roar over Cuba at 1,000 feet, taking photographs at much closer range than the U-2 spy planes. Their film picks up trucks, missiles in long tents, even the faces of individual soldiers, and workers clambering over the unfinished roof of a bunker for nuclear warheads.
And the low-level flights are especially disturbing to the Cuban population because it almost looks like they're at the level of the trees. And so whenever people hear them coming, they wonder, is this an invasion? Is this an attack? Or is this an unarmed reconnaissance flight? So it does terrorize the Cuban population.
In Washington, my father, Robert Kennedy, writes in his memoir of a sense of relief among the group the morning after the TV address. We had taken the first step. It wasn't so bad, and we were still alive. In the Oval Office in the evening, President Kennedy signs the 2-page proclamation authorizing the U.S. Navy to intercept Soviet ships. In the photographs taken to project the image around the world, he's a vision of determination. White handkerchief in his breast pocket, the flag behind him. But behind the scenes, there's uncertainty. How will the blockade really work? My father initially sees it as an opportunity to stop and search any Soviet ship, even if it has turned around, and to take photographs of the missiles they are carrying as evidence.
It would be a hell of an advantage to be able to come in and have pictures of the missiles and also...
But the others in the room urge caution. The president is worried that boarding any of these ships could lead to escalation.
He begins to have second thoughts about how it's actually going to be implemented. His Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, talks about what he calls a baby food scenario, that a Soviet ship comes along and refuses to stop, and that American forces board it, and it's all a public relations disaster because they find out it's not a shipment of missiles, but a shipment of baby food. So then Kennedy starts trying to talk this through, and he says, well, the Soviets are going to keep going, and then we're going to have to try to shoot their rudder off or the boiler, and then we're going to try to board it, and that's going to involve the use of force, perhaps machine guns, and we're going to have one hell of a time getting on board that ship. And of course, Kennedy had experience of serving in the Navy during World War II, which I think informed him in his reaction to the kind of difficulties they were going to face if they actually started to try to board Soviet ships.
Dean Rusk drafts a letter to Khrushchev urging Soviet ships to stay away from the quarantine line. The president signs it, adding a line at the end, "I am concerned that we both show prudence and do nothing to allow events to make the situation more difficult to control than it is."
La Isabela is a small port on the northern coast of Cuba, isolated, surrounded by mangrove swamps, open to hurricanes. But it's the closest port to the Alexandrovsk, with its high-risk cargo of nuclear warheads as it approaches Cuba. The ship is expected to dock at the larger port of Mariel along the coast, but the Soviets think the United States Navy is tracking the Alexandrovsk. The ship is ordered to change course and head to La Isabela. Michael Dobbs.
It's a flea-bitten port, open to hurricanes, and here it is, more explosive power than has ever been used in the history of warfare is suddenly located in this tiny little port on northern Cuba. Fidel Castro at least understands what's at stake here, and he sends his biggest artillery pieces to protect this port and to protect the warheads.
The Alexandrovsk, its cargo and its crew have survived the Atlantic crossing. It sits in port and waits to be unloaded.
There's another meeting that night for my father. At 9:30 p.m., he visits the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin. From the White House, it's a short walk down 16th Street to the opulent building the Soviet embassy occupies. A day earlier, when Dobrynin saw the text of President Kennedy's speech, he had turned pale. That was the first he had heard about the missile buildup in Cuba. In the lavish surroundings of the embassy, my father tells the ambassador that the president feels he has been intentionally deceived. He had believed Khrushchev's personal message that Khrushchev would do nothing to affect his election campaign. Dobrynin does not respond to the allegations. Instead, he counters that the naval quarantine is unlawful.
The ambassador doesn't know very much about what's going on. He's been kept in the dark by Moscow himself. And Bobby says, well, I'm not sure how this is going to end, but we're certainly going to stop your ships. And the ambassador replies, that would be an act of war.
By Tuesday night, it looks as if all of the channels of communication are breaking down.
At this point in the crisis, the two most powerful men on the planet resume their correspondence by letter. It's a painfully slow process in a fast-changing situation.
Because there were so many intermediaries. Any letter that Khrushchev was sending to Kennedy and vice versa, it would have to be, according to the diplomatic protocol, to be delivered to the embassy. Then someone would have to put that into the cipher. Then it has to be transmitted through radio waves to Washington, deciphered, printed, delivered to the White House, waiting for the president to have a break or time to read that. And on the top of that, there is, of course, time difference.
In response to Kennedy's letter setting out the terms of the blockade, Khrushchev writes a long, emotional reply on Wednesday, October 24th. He says the request to turn Soviet ships back from the quarantine line is an act of aggression that pushes mankind toward the abyss of a nuclear world war. He accuses Kennedy of declaring the blockade out of hatred for the Cuban people. He says it's unlawful, and then adds, "You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us." He also writes an even angrier personal letter for Kennedy's eyes only, but he sleeps on it and decides against sending it.
In the North Atlantic Ocean, the U.S. Navy deploys an armada of 180 ships in an arc 500 miles from the eastern tip of Cuba, ready to intercept the Soviets. It's 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday, the 24th of October. At the same time, in the cabinet room of the White House, the ex-com gather again for a meeting that my father recalls as the most trying, the most filled with tension. They begin with the ritual intelligence briefing from the CIA director, John McCone, and look at the pictures captured by the previous day's low-flying planes. There are 22 Soviet ships still en route to Cuba, and some are nearing the blockade barrier in the sea. 2 ships seem to be within a few miles of it, the Kimovsk and the Gagarin, with a fully armed Soviet submarine guarding between them. The Americans suspect that both ships are carrying missiles, and they are right.
As far as the president's concerned, the Soviet ships are still steaming straight ahead to the blockade line, and a confrontation between the US Navy and the Soviet Navy is imminent.
President Kennedy tells the Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, that the confrontation could quickly spiral out of control. But they are interrupted by John McCone. He's been handed a note.
Just received information through OMI.
6 ships in Cuban waters have either stopped or reversed course. Rusk asks what Cuban waters means. Are they leaving Cuba or coming in? Makes some difference, Rusk says, to nervous laughter around the room.
Most of these ships are outbound from Cuba to Soviet Union.
It's not clear immediately how they've turned around, when they've turned around, and which way they're going on now. So there's a few minutes when the president and his advisors don't really understand what is happening.
In those few minutes, the president and McNamara return to the Kimovsk and the Gagarin and the submarine in between them. Should they try to force the sub to surface? McNamara says they have to. There's too much danger to American ships otherwise.
I think it would be extremely dangerous, Mr. President, to try to defer attack on this submarine in the situation we're in. We could easily lose an American ship by that means.
My father writes in his memoir that this is the time of gravest concern to the president. He recalls that his face seemed drawn, his eyes pained, almost gray. We stared at each other across the table. For a few fleeting seconds, it was almost as though no one else was there, and he was no longer the president. But President Kennedy has to make a decision immediately. He says to McNamara, "Okay, let's proceed."
Many uncertainties, yeah. Okay, let's proceed. Mr. President, I do think it's important.
At 10:25, McCone returns to the cabinet room to confirm that the 6 ships heading towards the blockade have either stopped dead in the water or turned back towards the Soviet Union. These include the Kimovsk and the Gagarin. We were eyeball to eyeball and the other fellow just blinked, says Dean Rusk.
In other words, Khrushchev just blinked. He may certainly have believed that at the time, but I later discovered that this was not the case.
Michael Dobbs.
There was by no means the kind of instant communications that we imagine today. I think I was the first researcher to actually use US naval records to plot the positions of ships, and this actually tallied with the information that we have from the Soviet side. We have the minutes of the Politburo meeting where Khrushchev orders the return of the missile-carrying ships 2 nights before. Khrushchev ordered his ships to turn around on the evening of October 22nd when he first heard that Kennedy was going to impose a naval blockade. And at this moment, when Kennedy and his advisors think that the Soviet ships are about to go through the blockade line, what is in fact happening is that the ships carrying missiles, i.e. the crucial ships, have turned around and are headed back in the direction of the Soviet Union.
Back in the cabinet room, President Kennedy believes Khrushchev is obeying the quarantine.
Nikita Khrushchev wakes up on Wednesday, October 24th, to the news that the Alexandrovsk, carrying 80 times the explosive power of the Hiroshima bomb, is safely in port at La Isabela. The relief doesn't last for long. The United States Air Command has moved to DEFCON 2, 1 level short of nuclear war. DEFCON, or Defense Readiness Condition 1, would mean open warfare. The alert level has been raised by General Thomas Power, who oversees the U.S. Air Command's nuclear deterrent force. He deliberately gives the order over unprotected communication lines to his staff in military bases and bunkers across the world, knowing that the message will be intercepted by the Soviet Union